Michael Mad Dog Russo in New York and Daniel the Fox Harper in London weren't just names on the streets. They were legends feared on two continents, men whose ambition crossed oceans and whose crimes would ignite a battle between the world's most dangerous underworlds. On opposite sides of the Atlantic, two worlds of crime were quietly taking shape, each fueled by poverty, ambition, and a hunger for power. In America, sprawling cities became breeding grounds for violence. Streets filled with young men and women desperate to survive, desperate to be noticed. Gangs were born from these struggles, initially small and chaotic, but with the potential to grow into powerful empires. From the outside, it looked like random acts of violence, petty thefts, and street fights, but underneath, there was a system, a hierarchy, and an unspoken code that promised loyalty in exchange for protection and opportunity. The American dream had twisted into something darker, where success was measured not in dollars earned honestly, but in territories controlled, fear instilled, and rivals eliminated. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in the United Kingdom, danger moved in shadows. British streets were narrower, neighborhoods smaller, but the ambition was no less fierce. Gangs operated quietly, like a whispered rumor that could destroy lives without ever making a sound. Unlike the American approach, which relied on visibility and chaos, the British method was precise, controlled, and calculated. A single act of violence could serve as a warning to an entire city. Respect was demanded, not begged for, and loyalty was everything. Members knew that betrayal meant not just expulsion, but death. Influence spread subtly, through hidden channels and trusted networks that infiltrated legal businesses, nightclubs, and even law enforcement. Power in Britain was not just about control of the streets. It was about controlling the system itself from behind the scenes. Despite their differences, the gangs shared one essential trait, a hunger that could never be satisfied. Money, influence, and fear were universal currencies. The drive to dominate was relentless. In America, it was about building empires visible to the world, where streets knew your name and enemies feared your reach. In the UK, it was about staying invisible while pulling strings from the shadows, a quiet dominance that left no trace except results. Both sides grew stronger over time, learning from mistakes, expanding operations, and adapting to challenges. By the early 2000s, the two criminal worlds were on a collision course, connected by the demands of modern crime. International trade routes, technology, and the lure of untapped markets began bridging the gap between continents. American gangs saw opportunity overseas, while British gangs recognized the potential of working with partners who could provide scale and access they could not achieve alone. It was a silent, invisible thread linking two vastly different criminal landscapes, and neither side fully understood the consequences. Power, ambition, and fear became the language both understood. Cities grew restless under their influence, and authorities struggled to keep up. What appeared to be local problems were actually symptoms of a much larger, interconnected criminal network. The stage was set for a story that would cross oceans, challenge law enforcement, and redefine what it meant to be the world's most dangerous gangster. In this tale, neither side had the upper hand yet, but both were hungry, both were growing, and both were willing to risk everything to rise to the top. The streets of America and the alleys of the UK would never be the same again. In the United States, the rise of gangs was unstoppable, fueled by a combination of desperation, opportunity, and ruthless ambition. Cities that were once bustling centers of industry and community had pockets of neglect where young men and women grew up surrounded by violence, poverty, and broken families. These streets became training grounds for survival, where loyalty was earned through action and fear became a form of currency. Small crews that began with petty thefts and street-level drug sales quickly realized that organization was the key to growth. Leaders emerged from the chaos, charismatic yet merciless, able to inspire loyalty while demanding absolute obedience. By the late 1990s, the landscape of American crime had shifted. What started as local gangs controlling neighborhoods evolved into sprawling networks with influence across multiple cities and states. Drug distribution became a primary source of power and revenue. Routes were meticulously planned, territories fiercely protected, and competition eliminated with calculated precision. Violence was no longer random. It was a strategic tool used to instill fear and secure dominance. The most successful gangs operated like corporations, with hierarchies, specialized roles, and methods to launder money through legitimate businesses. Their reach extended into politics, law enforcement, and even entertainment, making them almost untouchable. Recruitment became another cornerstone of power. Young members were drawn in with promises of respect, money, and belonging. Many had grown up feeling invisible in their communities, and the allure of being part of something larger, something feared, was irresistible. Once inside, loyalty was enforced through rituals, intimidation, and a strict code of conduct. Betrayal was not an option. It meant death or exile. Members were trained to operate with efficiency, whether collecting debts, delivering drugs, or defending territories. The gangs were ruthless not just to outsiders, but also to themselves, constantly testing loyalty and weeding out weakness. Technology began to play a role in their rise as well. Phones, encrypted messaging, and later the internet allowed gangs to coordinate operations with unprecedented speed. Borders became less relevant as networks spread across state lines. Smuggling, trafficking, and money laundering operations grew more sophisticated, often leaving law enforcement scrambling to keep up. The gangs adapted faster than the authorities, learning from each raid and arrest, changing methods, and staying one step ahead. At the heart of this rise were the leaders, the visionaries, and the predators. Some were calculating masterminds who preferred strategy over brute force, while others relied on intimidation and terror. Yet all shared a common trait, an insatiable desire for control. They watched their empires grow and their enemies fall, expanding their reach into suburbs, smaller towns, and even rural areas. They turned chaos into opportunity, fear into influence, and violence into currency. By the early 2000s, American gangs had become more than street-level criminals. They were powerful organizations, capable of shaping the cities they operated in. Their presence was impossible to ignore, their influence far-reaching, and their ambition limitless. What had begun as small groups fighting for survival had transformed into a nationwide network of power, money, and terror. The rise of these gangs marked the beginning of an era where crime was no longer local, but national, and in some cases, global. The streets were theirs, and the law was struggling to catch up, leaving communities to navigate a new world ruled by fear and ambition. Across the Atlantic, in the United Kingdom, a different kind of criminal world was taking shape, quieter but just as deadly. British gangsters operated in the shadows, blending into everyday life while building empires hidden from public view. The streets were narrower, neighborhoods tighter, and the population more watchful, so subtlety became a weapon. Unlike their American counterparts, who relied on visibility and intimidation, UK gangs thrived on secrecy, patience, and influence. Their power was measured not by headlines or fear alone, but by control over the systems and people around them. A single act of violence could send a message to an entire city without anyone outside the criminal network ever knowing who was responsible. The rise of these gangs often began in overlooked neighborhoods, where young men felt trapped by limited opportunities and rigid social structures. From small beginnings, shoplifting, minor scams, or street-level drug sales, they built trust and loyalty within their networks. Leadership was earned carefully over years, with reputation and respect at the center of authority. Unlike in the United States, where large-scale operations required territory and manpower, British gangs could maintain dominance with relatively small, tightly knit groups. Their methods were precise, and each action was calculated to maximize gain while minimizing exposure. Violence was used sparingly, reserved for the moments when it could achieve the greatest psychological impact. Control extended beyond the streets. Many gangs infiltrated legal businesses, from clubs and bars to shipping and logistics. By blending legitimate operations with illegal activity, they created layers of protection that made detection difficult. They developed sophisticated money laundering schemes, turning cash earned from drugs, weapons, and smuggling into legitimate assets. This integration of crime with business allowed them to expand quietly, often operating under the radar of authorities who were chasing the more visible chaos seen in other countries. Loyalty and discipline were central to their strength. Betrayal was met with swift and often brutal consequences, and members were trained to remain silent, even under threat. This code of silence, or omerta, though borrowed from other criminal cultures, became deeply embedded in UK gangs. Trust was currency, and a single slip could unravel years of careful planning. Families and communities were often caught in the crossfire, unknowingly contributing to or protecting the networks that operated among them. By the early 2000s, British gangs had grown into sophisticated organizations capable of challenging the state itself. They controlled ports, nightlife, and transportation channels, allowing illegal goods to flow across the country and beyond. Their operations were often invisible, leaving authorities with only fragments of evidence to piece together. Yet the effects of their power were undeniable. Fear, corruption, and influence spread through cities like a slow-moving but unstoppable force. These gangs thrived because they understood the value of patience. While American gangs often rushed to expand and demonstrate power through violence, British networks prioritized stability, longevity, and discretion. Their influence was subtle but absolute. By quietly embedding themselves in the structures of society, they created a form of control that was harder to dismantle. A shadow empire built on precision, loyalty, and fear. The streets of the UK had become a chessboard, and these gangsters were always thinking several moves ahead, ensuring that their reach extended far beyond what anyone could see. Their rise proved that crime could be silent, unseen, and yet far more dangerous than the chaos of the streets. As the criminal empires on both sides of the Atlantic grew, an unexpected connection began to form between the United States and the United Kingdom. What had once seemed like isolated networks, operating independently within their own borders, began to intersect through the lure of profit, influence, and opportunity. American gangs, always looking to expand their markets, saw potential in working with UK networks that had mastered discretion and control. British gangs, in turn, recognized the value of alliances that could provide scale, access to new routes, and connections that extended beyond Europe. It was a meeting of two distinct approaches to crime, one bold and overt, the other calculated and invisible, and together they formed a partnership that neither side had fully anticipated. The alliance was built carefully, quietly, and mostly through intermediaries. It was not a grand announcement, but rather a series of small, calculated moves. Shipping routes were manipulated to carry contraband under the guise of legitimate trade. Money began to flow across borders, hidden in offshore accounts and disguised as business transactions. Drugs, weapons, and other illegal goods moved through international ports, from the docks of New York to the harbors of London, passing through secure warehouses controlled by trusted operatives. Both sides shared intelligence, learning from each other's methods and refining operations in ways that made them harder to track and dismantle. This transatlantic connection introduced a new level of sophistication to organized crime. American gangs brought scale, manpower, and the ability to dominate through force when necessary. British gangs contributed stealth, strategic planning, and knowledge of law enforcement loopholes. Together, they were able to combine speed with subtlety, brutality with discretion, creating networks that were both invisible and intimidating. Even law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring domestic gangs began to struggle As patterns emerged that spanned continents, the crimes were no longer isolated incidents. They were coordinated operations, executed with precision and backed by international resources. But the partnership was not without risk. Trust was fragile, and both sides had to navigate cultural differences, rivalries, and internal suspicions. A misstep by one group could expose the entire network. Communication had to be encrypted, meetings carefully staged, and identities protected. Despite their combined power, the threat of betrayal loomed constantly, reminding both American and British gangsters that one careless move could undo years of careful planning. The consequences of this connection were far-reaching. Cities that had once seen crime as a local problem now faced threats that had origins thousands of miles away. Law enforcement began noticing trends that could not be explained by domestic activity alone. New drug types, unexplained financial flows, and violent incidents that mirrored patterns from across the ocean. Authorities started realizing that they were facing a form of organized crime that had transcended national borders. By connecting their operations, gangs from the United States and the United Kingdom had created something more powerful than either could achieve alone. It was a silent, invisible network stretching across the Atlantic, built on greed, ambition, and the unrelenting drive to dominate. The stage was set for an unprecedented confrontation, one that would test loyalty, strategy, and the limits of both criminal empires. What had started as ambition in separate countries had now grown into a global force, and the world would soon see the full scale of its reach power. As intoxicating as it was always carried a hidden danger, and for the gangsters of America and the United Kingdom, that danger came from within. In the United States, as gangs grew into sprawling empires, cracks began to appear in the foundations they had built. Leaders who once seemed untouchable found themselves facing rivalries not just from other gangs, but from within their own ranks. Ambitious lieutenants, impatient for recognition and power, began plotting in secret. Alliances that had held for years started to fray, and trust, once the most valuable currency, became fragile. A single act of disloyalty, a secret betrayal, or a whispered rumor could spiral into violence that consumed the very organizations that had built it. In the United Kingdom, the story was similar, but played out with far more subtlety. The networks that had thrived on secrecy and patience were vulnerable to the same human flaws: greed, ambition, and fear. Trusted operatives began leaking information, either intentionally or under pressure, and small mistakes began to ripple through the organization. One miscalculated move could expose entire networks, from smuggling routes to money laundering schemes. What had once been invisible now threatened to become visible, as authorities started to piece together fragments of evidence from leaks and surveillance. The quiet precision that had protected these gangs for years now seemed fragile, and the leaders realized that their empires were not invincible. The first major cracks often went unnoticed by the public, appearing as small betrayals or suspicious activity. In reality, they were harbingers of larger collapse. In America, internal disputes escalated quickly into deadly confrontations, with longtime allies turning on each other to protect their positions. Territories were contested, operations disrupted, and once loyal members disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The very networks that had made these gangs powerful were now channels for their downfall, as rival factions exploited weaknesses and law enforcement began connecting dots that had been hidden for years. Across the Atlantic, British networks faced similar instability. Leaders found that even a single careless operative could unravel years of careful planning. Entire routes, accounts, and connections were at risk as trust deteriorated. A silent betrayal in London could have ripple effects reaching ports in Liverpool, warehouses in Manchester, and even shipments heading overseas. The empire built on patience and discretion was suddenly exposed to the dangers of human error, and the calm, calculated control that had defined it was replaced by uncertainty and fear. The consequences of these betrayals were swift and brutal. In both countries, gang leaders were forced to act decisively to protect their power. Enforcers were deployed, alliances reshaped, and rival factions eliminated. Yet even as the strongest survived, the exposure had changed the landscape. What once seemed untouchable was now vulnerable, and the public, law enforcement, and rival gangs all sensed the instability. The very success that had elevated these empires had also planted the seeds of their undoing. By the time authorities began to notice the patterns, the networks were already weakened from internal strife. The rise of betrayal at the top was a turning point, a moment where the hunger for power collided with the inevitability of human ambition. Leaders realized too late that while they could dominate streets and markets, they could not control the impulses and fears of those closest to them. The stage was set for a series of exposures and arrests that would challenge both American and British gangs in ways they had never faced before. The cracks were no longer hidden, they were widening, and the fall of empires had begun. The moment of reckoning came quietly, but with devastating precision. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the Atlantic had been tracking the movements, finances, and communications of gang networks for years. But the rise of transatlantic connections forced them to coordinate on a scale never seen before. In the United States, federal agencies worked alongside state and local authorities, pooling intelligence and sharing resources. In the United Kingdom, metropolitan police collaborated with international task forces to monitor the flow of money, goods, and information. What had once been a local problem had become a global one, and the response needed to match the scale of the threat. Operations were planned meticulously, often for months, with every detail considered. Surveillance teams monitored warehouses, shipping routes, and suspected safe houses, while financial analysts traced the flow of illicit funds through layers of legal businesses and offshore accounts. Arrests were timed to minimize the risk of escape and ensure maximum impact. In America, dawn raids descended on sprawling compounds, catching gang members off guard and dismantling entire networks in a single day. In the UK, officers struck quietly, shutting down operations in silent but decisive movements that left communities reeling. The gangs, despite their sophistication, were suddenly exposed to a level of coordination that they had never anticipated. Some gang leaders vanished before they could be apprehended, slipping into hiding or fleeing overseas. Others were captured without resistance, their empires collapsing around them as the law moved in. Evidence that had been painstakingly gathered over years became the foundation for charges that ranged from drug trafficking and arms smuggling to money laundering and conspiracy. The scale of the operation revealed just how deeply organized crime had infiltrated both countries. What had seemed like isolated acts of violence and theft was, in reality, a vast, interconnected system stretching from American cities to British ports. The impact on the criminal world was immediate. Territories that had been controlled by powerful gangs were left vulnerable, leaving opportunities for smaller, less experienced groups to step in. The arrests sent shockwaves through the networks, undermining trust and destabilizing alliances. Members who had once operated with confidence found themselves exposed, unsure of who could be trusted. The cycle of fear and loyalty that had sustained these organizations began to unravel, and the delicate balance of power shifted almost overnight. At the same time, the operations demonstrated the potential of international collaboration against crime. Agencies learned from each other, combining tactics, intelligence, and expertise to target networks that were becoming increasingly global. The success of these joint efforts highlighted the vulnerability of even the most powerful criminal organizations when faced with coordinated action. For the first time, the idea of untouchable gang leaders was being challenged on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet despite the scale of the crackdown, the story was far from over. The networks that had survived began to adapt, laying low, reorganizing, and searching for gaps in enforcement. While some leaders faced justice, others vanished into the shadows, waiting for the opportunity to rise again. The global crackdown marked a turning point, a demonstration that even the most sophisticated criminal empires could be brought to heel, but it also revealed that the hunger for power, money, and control could never be fully extinguished. The battle between law enforcement and organized crime had entered a new era, one defined by scale, strategy, and an unrelenting struggle for dominance. The fall of the gang empires marked a dramatic shift in the criminal landscape, but it was not the end of the story. Courtrooms replaced streets as the final battleground, and the battles fought behind closed doors were as intense and calculated as those once waged in alleyways and warehouses. Evidence collected over years of surveillance, undercover operations, and financial investigations painted a damning picture of greed, ambition, and violence. Prosecutors meticulously built cases that exposed not only individual crimes, but entire organizational structures, revealing how deeply networks had penetrated communities, businesses, and even political systems. For American gangs, the courtroom became a stage where power could no longer intimidate. Leaders who once commanded loyalty from dozens of operatives now faced juries, judges, and prosecutors, armed with evidence they could not manipulate. Long sentences were handed down, often spanning decades, and the names that had once inspired fear on city streets were reduced to headlines and legal citations. Territories that had been contested through violence were now emptied, leaving rival factions scrambling and leaving younger members without guidance or protection. The collapse was both sudden and total, exposing vulnerabilities that had existed for years, but were masked by fear and intimidation. Across the United Kingdom, similar scenes unfolded. British gang leaders, who had built their empires on discretion and control, found themselves vulnerable in ways they had never anticipated. Meticulous documentation, financial records, and testimonies from former operatives dismantled networks that had seemed untouchable. The quiet, invisible power they had wielded was rendered ineffective in the face of law enforcement coordination and judicial scrutiny. Courtrooms that had once been distant threats now became instruments of their downfall, stripping them of influence and leaving communities to grapple with the aftermath. The human cost of these operations was enormous. Families, neighborhoods, and communities that had been caught in the crossfire or complicit through fear were left to rebuild. Streets that had once vibrated with the presence of gangs felt different, quieter, uncertain, but scarred. Businesses previously under criminal control had to navigate the sudden removal of influence and protection, while ordinary citizens faced the lingering fear and instability left behind. The legacy of these empires was not easily erased, and the shadow of their actions remained, even as the leaders themselves were incarcerated. The fall of the kings also revealed the adaptability of organized crime. While major leaders were removed, smaller groups began to fill the voids left behind, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors. Authorities recognized that dismantling an empire was only one part of the battle. Preventing new ones from emerging required constant vigilance, reform, and community engagement. The courtroom victories were significant, but the underlying social and economic conditions that had allowed these empires to rise remained ultimately. The downfall of America's and the UK's most notorious gang leaders demonstrated that no empire, no matter how powerful, was invincible. Power built on fear and loyalty could crumble under scrutiny, evidence, and coordinated effort. Yet the story also served as a warning. The collapse of one generation of criminals created opportunities for another. The streets, though temporarily free of these kings, remained a battleground where ambition, greed, and the desire for control would continue to drive the rise of the next wave of dangerous gangsters, proving that the cycle of crime and consequence was far from over. The fall of the great gang empires did not signal the end of organized crime. Instead, it revealed a cycle that seemed impossible to break. Even as the leaders were imprisoned, disappeared, or otherwise removed from power, new figures quietly observed from the shadows, studying the mistakes of their predecessors and the gaps left in the criminal networks. The streets of America and the United Kingdom were never truly empty. They were merely waiting for the next generation to step in, armed with lessons learned, ambition renewed, and the same insatiable desire for money, power, and influence. In the United States, smaller crews began to assert themselves in territories left abandoned by powerful gangs. These groups were often younger, hungrier, and more willing to take risks. They had grown up watching the rise and fall of the old empires, understanding the importance of both violence and strategy. Some chose to replicate the brash, overt style of American gangsters, seeking to dominate neighborhoods with visibility and intimidation. Others adopted a more careful approach, observing the consequences of overreach and learning to move quietly while expanding their influence. The criminal landscape, once dominated by a few powerful names, became more fragmented but no less dangerous. Across the United Kingdom, a similar pattern emerged. The discreet, calculated networks that had once ruled with precision were replaced by new operators who were increasingly aware of both law enforcement tactics and global criminal trends. Some sought to maintain the traditional emphasis on secrecy and loyalty, while others experimented with bolder strategies that involved rapid expansion, international connections, or blending more aggressively into legitimate business sectors. The careful balance of influence and control was being tested again, proving that the principles of power in the UK underworld were resilient but continually evolving. The global connection between American and British gangs, which had once seemed like a fragile alliance, continued to shape the rise of new criminal figures. Lessons learned from the previous era, how to manage smuggling routes, launder money, and communicate without detection, became part of the blueprint for emerging empires. Technology accelerated the process, allowing younger criminals to coordinate across borders in ways that their predecessors could only dream of. Encrypted messaging, digital financial systems, and global shipping networks became tools for the ambitious, providing both opportunity and risk. Yet the story also highlighted a harsh reality. Organized crime is not just a matter of individuals, but of the conditions that allow them to thrive. Poverty, inequality, corruption, and social instability created fertile ground for new leaders to emerge. The collapse of one empire did not resolve these underlying issues, leaving communities vulnerable to the next wave of criminals. The battle between authority and ambition was ongoing, and while arrests, prosecutions, and crackdowns could disrupt operations, they could not fully eliminate the underlying hunger for power and control. The rise and fall of America's and the UK's most dangerous gangsters served as both a warning and a lesson. Power, when built on fear, loyalty, and greed, is fleeting, yet the drive to achieve it never disappears. The streets, neighborhoods, and cities are always at risk, shaped by human ambition and the choices of those willing to break the law to claim what they desire. For every empire that falls, another is already rising, learning from the past and preparing to challenge the world once more. The cycle continues, a relentless testament to the enduring allure and danger of organized crime.